Welcome, everybody. My name is Kerry Sautner. I'm the president and CEO here at Eastern State Penitentiary. You're actually live streaming from Eastern State Penitentiary, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan museum here in Philadelphia, but it's also the site of the world's first penitentiary, America's first penitentiary and the world's first penitentiary, a place that wanted to look at incarceration and question the criminal justice system to do it differently. Now, there's a whole bunch of conversations we have in this Justice 101 series about did they do that? Did they not do that? Really didn't, because they were also the people who invented mass solitary confinement, which we know today. And they knew pretty well back then was one of the most painful ways that somebody could be put in an incarcerated setting. So these are so many fascinating conversations. And a part of the work we do here is to really look at the justice system over time and examine it to understand why we have the patterns that we do in the law, in society, and in our incarcerated settings, also in our reentry settings. And then what is our task and our job to do as people in this society today? And how do we make those great changes? So Justice 101 is one of those signature programs that really likes to dive in. It comes out of our Eastern States Center for Justice Education. And this series happens once a month, sometimes in person, always online. And we're just grateful for everybody to come join us today. Now, today's topic, again, a huge topic and a fascinating topic, is really going to center around the civil rights movement. And that in itself is a question when we talk about which civil rights movement, and looking at the civil rights movement relationship to the justice system, both policing and incarceration. So I am so honored to welcome you here. And I'm going to say it officially once, and then I promise I'll stop saying it, Professor Roberts, to join us today. We are honored to have you here. We are so excited to have this conversation. And everybody who's joining us today, I just want to give you a little bit of context about our professor and the expertise that we have in the room with us today. So Professor Roberts is the George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, with joint appointments in the Department of African Studies and Sociology and the law school, where she is the inaugural Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Mosel Alexander, thank you, Alexander Professor of Civil Rights. You have written amazing books on understanding the criminal justice system and the criminal legal system. One of those books that is on my list that I have stacked on the pile beside my reading list is Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty. I think that is so unbelievably important as we look into these conversations, as we think about this physical site of incarceration and what it tells in the story of our American society, not just in 1822 when this place was built and when it welcomed its first incarcerated person. His name was Charles in 1829, but the ideas that came in 1776 and 1787 when the idea of this place came about. What a year to think about not just freedom and liberty and justice, but the removal of that freedom, of that liberty, and of justice. So I want to welcome you here with us today. We are honored to have you here, and I am so excited for this conversation. So please welcome and thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So I'm going to start out with a big picture question, and then we're going to dive in. Now, everybody online, we like to have a really healthy and robust conversation. So we know that as we're talking, and I'll go through a bunch of questions, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. Don't worry, I'll read them for you. So if you're worried your mic isn't working, that's okay. You're in the great abyss, and we will read them for you. So just let us know questions whenever they pop into your head, and we'll weave them in. But also, we'll probably be referencing some great books that I already referenced, also some great articles. We have a list of them already for you. We'll send a roundup after this program, so you get the video and you get all the links. So you don't have to worry about taking notes and homework. You get to engage and listen. We'll do it for you. It's always nice to have the stress off of you and to have somebody taking notes for you. So my big picture question to kick this off is, and again, I understand the complexity of this question, so go there if you want to go there. how do we understand the civil rights movement and its relationship to the justice system? And I understand that most people, when they think about the civil rights movement, they really anchor it around the 50s and the 60s. Some of that really starting in the 1940s, the 50s and 60s. But this concept of Americans and people fighting for human dignity and civil rights goes far before the 1950s and 60s.
Mhm.
But we also have this conversation that it's usually around people really lock it around voting. And
Mhm.
it is so much associated, the 50s civil rights movement, with the justice system. So could you tell us a little bit about that broader civil rights movement? And then a little bit about how the 1940s, 50s, and 60s civil rights movement saw the justice system as a huge tenet, that it was their responsibility to have the American people understand and make change.
Yes. So I think that very often, as you suggested, when people think about the civil rights movement, they think about the 1960s and they also think about certain kinds of rights. They think about voting, about being included in the labor market without discrimination, uh, residential segregation and inclusion into neighborhoods wherever you want to live. In other words, there's a focus on how, prior to the civil rights movement, Black people and other marginalized people were excluded from the privileges and rights and entitlements that the Constitution and democracy entitled them to. And I think sometimes people don't think about punishment as also being something we have to struggle around, also being part of the civil rights movement. In other words, there's a distinction between being included in the benefits of living in this nation and being punished. And so sometimes punishment and the criminal legal system, from policing to incarceration to capital punishment, those are left out of discussions. I think it also has something to do with, we are told there's this propaganda around supporting prisons and policing, that people who are policed and people who are incarcerated, it's because of something immoral they did. It's their own fault. This is punishment of individual desert. And sometimes there isn't a focus on how policing and prisons operate structurally. And so, just to begin my answer to your question, just to recognize that civil rights and the civil rights struggle have included and must include challenging the criminal legal system, challenging punishment and surveillance, as well as challenging exclusion. I've talked about this as well when we think about. I know that this may sound a little off topic, but AI and how so often the approach to it is, how do we include people in the digital age? And we also have to think about the people who are surveilled as a result of it. So it's never just fighting against exclusion. We also have to fight against inclusion in structurally oppressive systems. And so many civil rights activists, especially those in prison, have recognized the way in which prisons and policing are central to a civil rights struggle, because these systems have historically been you could argue the primary way that racial hierarchy in America has been enforced and used as justifications for brutal state violence and unequal citizenship. So any kind of civil rights struggle has to take prisons and policing into account. Again, because those are such powerful instruments for the state to continue to enforce and replicate racial hierarchies in America. And it goes back to what I was saying about individual desert versus structural oppression. it's so easy to frame the harms that are perpetrated on people because of their race as just neutral law enforcing punishment on people who deserve it. And so that's another reason why it's so important to have a civil, to include opposing prisons and policing in the civil rights struggle. I can just quickly give some examples of that, and then we can dive in more.
That
It's,
sounds great.
yeah, the ways in which policing and prisons have reinforced racial control and a racial hierarchy. We can look at the post-Civil War criminalization of Black people through what were called Black codes and the convict leasing system. So the primary way that white supremacists in the South wanted to re-enslave Black people and take back control over Black people's lives, to continue to subjugate Black Americans even after they were emancipated from slavery, was through the criminal legal system. Uh, Codes, either Black codes specifically directed at Black Americans, but also just general criminal codes. I think this is an important point because you can have racial oppression without race-based laws, race-specific laws, just general criminal laws that are enforced in a racially biased way or that were designed, even if they don't mention race, to target Black people. And so through either specific Black codes or just the general criminal codes, vagrancy, for example, where that allowed police to pick up any Black person on the street and just claim that they were a vagrant. They were where they weren't supposed to be, jail them and then lease them out, lease their labor out, forced labor out to companies that were rebuilding the South, railroads and coal mines. Some scholars have said it was worse than slavery because they were being worked to death, literally, in this kind of forced labor extraction under extremely brutal conditions, with little motivation to care for the bodies of these people, their welfare, their health, because they could just be worked to death and you'd get more from the jails. And then we see mass incarceration, the buildup of the largest prison population in the world in the United States. And especially when you look at the rates of incarceration of Black people, higher than anywhere, I mean, astronomically higher than rates of incarceration anywhere in the world. Just not just a little bit higher, but multiple times higher in the United States, as uh, Michelle Alexander famously called the new Jim Crow, just a new way of enforcing racial hierarchy and oppression through the prisons. So civil rights activism has recognized that these are important injustices that should be challenged, and they're just as harmful and just as controlling of Black people as are other forms of discrimination, like and keeping people from voting or discrimination in housing and employment.
Thank you. That was unbelievably helpful and really well rounded. And I think this is the complexity of these conversations when we go into them and we look at incarceration in America,
Mhm.
when we look at the civil rights movement, and you really dig into that civil rights movement to say, what are the layers beyond kind of and not to minimize it, but
Mhm.
when we celebrate MLK Day, it's such a powerful day. It's such a powerful day of alignment and belief. But when you dig past those opening, amazing movements, amazing people, amazing words, not just of Martin Luther King, but of people like Rosa Parks, there's
Mhm.
so many more intricate stories to tell.
Mhm.
And so you start to say, and you open, it's like Pandora's box of understanding, you start to open that and you're like, wait a minute, what was Rosa Parks doing for 40 years before she sat on the bus?
Mhm.
How is, you know, what was the connection between what Rosa Parks did and the belief that Emmett Till had not found justice? Like all these things layer
Yeah.
in, you
Mhm.
know, and like I remember the first time I heard the story of Rosa Parks saying to herself, do it for Emmett. And walking onto the bus and like just thinking like what are those connections, and that's what we love to encourage is these conversations. And for our participants online, we talk about nerding out on this, go down rabbit holes,
Mhm.
kind of see those cross connections. And that's what we see around the civil rights movement and around the justice system and around the system of incarceration. You start to peel back those layers and you start to see things in the justice system and in the system of incarceration where you start to see, oh, that's why they call it a system. Oh, that's why our last scholars in December, we did a program on the Eighth Amendment. I really encourage everybody to see it. The Brennan Center was with us, and LB from the Brennan Center. She's like, it's more like a web that's sticky, and you get brought into it and then pulled in. So I also really just want to appreciate that you brought in policing around this too, because
Mhm.
as we examine policing, what are the laws that are established through Congress and through the states that the police are then enforcing? And then what is the systematic work of the police over time that has created this? It's not just one piece, it's a full system. And for us to really understand it and to live to our Constitution, which is establishing justice,
Mhm.
and to live to the legacy of the civil rights movement that isn't over, then we need to do the work through it. So thank you so much for giving all that context to us
Mhm.
because it is really helpful. And for me, again, because I love the Constitution, I always go back to what you said earlier about you said included and it punished as well. So it's the privileges and immunities. That's what I always hear in the 14th Amendment. It's
Mhm.
the privileges of immunities of these laws.
Mhm.
So you should be guaranteed both the equal justice under the law and from the law.
Mhm.
That is like the part. So everybody, we're gonna nerd out. We'll send you the 14th Amendment, but look at that. Look at the words that are chosen, and they chose that on purpose.
Mhm.
And so when we look at some of the writers of that, and let's be really clear that Bingham was one of the lead writers on it, but he was being influenced by the colored people's conventions that were leading up to the writing of that 14th Amendment. And at those conventions, both men and women calling for even handed justice under the law. That's in the 1860s.
Mhm.
100 years later, you hear the echo in the civil rights movement calling for even handed justice. So, can you kind of help unpack the 1940s, 1960s civil rights movement and kind of the specific work around um, the legal system? Like, so when people were brought to court, and what did we see really in those court cases, and the punishment that was given um, to somebody who may have committed a crime, and how that was uneven based on race, and why the civil rights movement said, look at this. We want a fair and even handed justice system. This isn't even. Look at the data, look at the numbers.
Yes. So part of what civil rights activists and prison activists as well were fighting against was the denial of rights that were guaranteed under the Constitution to people in prison. That's one piece of it. Just the idea that the Constitution doesn't end at the prison walls. The Constitution applies within prisons as well. And so just that basic idea that incarcerated people are entitled to civil rights. And we can get more into that. Your question was specifically about
We'll
equal.
go there next, though.
Yeah, we can go there next. But that is an important piece of it. And I want to get at just that basic idea that people who are incarcerated don't give up their rights because they're incarcerated. Yes, they don't have the right to total liberty and freedom that other people have, but that doesn't mean they don't have religious rights, due process rights, rights against actually this is in the Constitution, unusual and cruel punishment. So that's an important aspect of civil rights litigation that was achieved during the 1960s and then into the 1970s as well. But, I guess we'll get into it, but beginning in 1964 with Cooper versus Pate, which held that prisoners could bring constitutional challenges against prison officials. That was an important aspect of the civil rights movement regarding prisons. Then also another important aspect was as you were pointing out, the unequal punishment of crimes, with Black people getting greater punishments. Also I mean, there's just so many, like we said, it's complex because they were getting greater punishments, but they were also more likely to be convicted because of all white juries made up often of people who were just obsessed with anti-Black racism. So the challenges to the all-white juries were also important. As another aspect of it was the capital punishment. Black people were far more likely to be convicted of capital crimes. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court has never held that racial discrimination and capital punishment is a reason to abolish capital punishment. That unfortunate, as one of the justices said, there was fear of too much freedom, too much justice, too much justice, and that's why the court did not hold that racial discrimination and capital punishment was grounds to hold it was unconstitutional. But the court in the 1960s did hold, as a result of civil rights activism, that capital punishment for rape was unconstitutional. And that largely came up because Black men were being convicted on typically false charges of rape, as they were also being lynched with the cooperation of sheriffs in towns for alleged sexual assault or even just any kind of sexual touching or sometimes even just looking at a white woman. So all of these aspects of injustice within the criminal legal system were being challenged by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, by the ACLU, and again, importantly, by prisoners themselves. And that 1964 case of Cooper versus Pate was helped to fuel the prisoners' rights movement that relied largely on civil rights lawsuits. In fact, one professor who studies this found that the number of prisoners' rights suits increased dramatically from 218 in 1966 to 18,000, over 18,000 lawsuits in 1984. And uh, then by 1996, they had increased 400% from 1970 to 1996. So prison activism in the 60s and 70s uh, just skyrocketed as a result of the civil rights movement establishing in federal court that prisoners had the right to bring constitutional claims in court. They had the right to bring civil rights claims. Before that, there was absolute discretion given to prison officials, to police, uh, to do what they wanted to do as an instrument of racial control. And I think today everybody knows about Miranda rights, this is not to say that they're always enforced. This is why the civil rights movement and struggle to uh, either radically transform the prison system or abolish it altogether continues, because despite these successes of the civil rights movement, we still see the rampant violation of incarcerated people's rights and uh, many aspects of prison, and of course, prison itself, continuing to be a major instrument of structural racism in this nation.
And so much of that is really kind of, again, we're less likely to analyze these, what we refer to as like these black box areas where we can't see in. We can't see what's going on behind the curtain. We
Yeah.
see that the courts have left discretion. That's a unique setting for lots of different reasons. Saying that's a unique setting, we don't weigh in on that. And oddly enough, and I find this quite fascinating, that this is how the rights around classrooms were determined as well. It was very much like, oh, no, no, the classroom is a completely unique setting. We defer to the experts there. Which is fascinating because we always so often don't defer to teachers and experts. So, but that time we do. But I think what's really interesting as you kind of tell that story and you weave that thread, we're looking at the unequal writing of laws, where one law might not have a direct implication to race, but really does have a direct implication of race. I always
Yeah.
think of crack cocaine, and the laws around basically similar types of chemicals,
Yeah.
but when they're illegal substances, one is used by one community more than another one is used by
Mhm.
one community, and it can be weaponized. So we look at the unfair writing of the laws, and then we look at the unfair prosecution and application of the laws.
Yeah.
Jeremiah Reeves, which I'm pretty sure I just dropped in the chat that case. Here, let me do it right now. This is the case that I think there is and we'll send it out to everybody. There's a passionate speech in 1954 from Martin Luther King on the steps of a vigil to push back on the 1952 case of a 16-year-old boy, African American boy, who was sentenced to execution and was executed for the rape of a white
Yeah.
woman and when you unpack the case, you realize that that was a consensual relationship, and that because of societal, she said it was rape. This happens over and over again. And what you mentioned earlier, from first of all, when we understand that rape was an executional,
Mhm.
that is not in the modern context, but it was from the 30s and then through the 60s and 70s
Mhm.
or 60s. But
Mhm.
when you look at the numbers, and this is why the way that I like to go at these, because my brain is a math brain,
Mhm.
90% of these cases, year after year, of executions for rape are Black men.
Mhm.
90%.
Mhm.
So are we applying the law and the sentencing in a fair way? And that's what MLK says in that prayer vigil. He's like, I'm not even talking about if this person was wrong or right, if they did it or they didn't do it.
Yeah.
That's not my point here. And I think
Yeah.
that's so powerful because when we talk about justice, there is there is a belief of, can the government do that? That's when we talk about the criminal legal system. We're saying, do you, as Americans, give your power to the government and allow them to do that? Do you want your government to make unfair and unjust laws? And so that is really how we unpack these conversations and look at that application today and how do we see it today. And thank you so much for bringing up also the conversation of, when do we start to see these constitutional rights finally being tested? Because you do not lose your rights. You are still a citizen. You
Yeah.
still have rights. And let's be honest, our Constitution is written not just to talk about citizens, but
No.
it intentionally says persons. So
Yes.
read that 14th Amendment. I'll go back to it. It says, and they did that
Exactly.
intentionally. That wasn't a mistake. That
No.
was intentional, and you can read the documents behind it. So all of this context really matters. And it is our responsibility as Americans to question and say, are we applying this appropriately? Now, we do know that rights are limited, but we also know that rights are not dissolved when you're in these settings, school settings, incarcerated settings. So really, really powerful. When we look at that today, what do you see as some of the biggest questions around the civil rights movement today? And then the second side of that, the civil rights movement within incarcerated settings. So some of the questions that we've been seeing come up over the course of the years about the Civil Rights Act
Mhm.
and the teeth and the power that was in the Civil Rights Act when it was passed, and where we're not seeing that today, and how's it coming out in the law? and in society. And I just will nod before I let you finally finish this question is I
Mhm.
think it's so powerful that your role at University of Pennsylvania shows that duality of not just the law, but at society. That we cannot look at the law without looking at society. We cannot look at society without looking at our systems of justice, fairness, and oppression at the same time. So thank you.
Of
It says
course.
so much for that.
Thank you. Well, there was this period in the 60s and 70s where we definitely saw expansion or recognition of rights of incarcerated people and people suspected or arrested for crimes. And as I mentioned, the prisoners' rights movement exploded in the 60s and 70s because of prior litigation that recognized they had rights. The ACLU National Prison Project had a number of victories. So some victories against excessive force, against shackling, again having to do with medical care. But none of these dismantled mass incarceration. In fact, in mass incarceration, the prison system continued to skyrocket during this very period. In fact, it really, you could see the prison expansion as a backlash against those civil rights gains. And then we have this period in the 70s, 80s, 90s, even in the 90s, under a Democratic Congress, Democratic President Clinton, you see another neoliberal and expansion of law and order. It happened under uh, President Reagan as well, but I want to highlight that even under a Democratic and seemingly liberal president, we get this law and order, the law that the criminal, I don't even like to use the word justice because it's so,
I know. And I was going to say,
but
you can feel free to explain that too.
yes,
You could feel
the
free.
unjust law in the criminal legal system that led to more police going into Black neighborhoods, arresting more people, and expansion of prisons. And I'm not sure if we'll get to the question about child welfare and policing of families, but I'll just mention that during the same period in the 1990s, we also see the welfare restructuring law that ended the federal entitlement to welfare. And there's always been this connection between the unwillingness of many Americans to grant welfare rights to Black people, which white people have had, during even before the New Deal. But the idea that Black people should get any kind of government assistance, there's always been a great opposition to that, and that came to the fore in the 1990s with the 1996 law that ended the federal entitlement to welfare. And then the following year, another law which fewer people recognize is the Adoption and Safe Families Act in 1997 that was directed at ending parental rights of Black mothers. The promotion of it was explicitly racist, and moving Black children out of foster care where they were disproportionately making up at the time almost half of the foster care population was Black, and moving them into adoption with incentives for adoption and speeding up termination of parental rights. So all of this, I mention these laws because we can see the entanglement of criminal punishment and in the civil side, the denial of uh, government assistance and also the intrusion into Black families and breaking up, tearing apart Black families. So all of this comes together. You mentioned the word web. It's a web not only within the criminal legal system, but a web between the criminal legal system and the medical system, the healthcare system, the child welfare system, the education system. And so we're now living in an intensified period. The 1990s were nothing compared to what we're going through now with attacks on uh, efforts to end the racial hierarchy and racial inequality in America, seen as if those are unconstitutional, that those are forms of discrimination. And we're seeing it in prisons. It's almost every day I read stories about incarcerated people who've been murdered by guards or guards who sick other prisoners on them to murder them. Sexual assault within prisons. Uh, you mentioned solitary confinement, this horrific form of torture of incarcerated people, all of this still going on in prisons despite the victories of the civil rights movement. And so this struggle has not ended by any means. And I think we're in a period where we really need to be more vigilant and more active in opposing the way in which criminal surveillance and punishment are used. And we can now add deportation, the supposed law enforcement of the immigration laws as a piece of this that's been intensified. So all of that coming together is something we have to keep vigilant about, and we have to keep struggling for an end to these oppressive forms of surveillance and punishment. And as importantly, uh, imagining how we can have a truly democratic society and a truly humane society that grants and recognizes the equal humanity and equal rights of everybody.
That is so unbelievably powerful and so well said. And I really appreciate you really transforming us from this is how bad it is to we can do something about this too, because it is really when you layer through this, it does get to the point where you start to think there's too many bad things happening. But it is the responsibility of a just and fair democracy
Yeah.
to check in on that. And I just want to like articulate for the audience like a little bit about will you'll hear us saying words like a justice system or a criminal legal system, making those choices. And you'll
Mhm.
hear it across the field about, is it really a justice system? Can I use those words when I don't believe it's a just system? And then there's people like me that hold on to hope for a full justice system. Giving up on it. But
Yes.
this idea that reform is always needed but should always be questioned. And so I think what the best story that I can share around that is
Mhm.
around Eastern State. So Eastern State begins in 1787, in early spring of 1787, before the Constitution, and there some of the great minds are coming together and saying we have these miserable, literally the misery of prisons was the group that came together and
Mhm.
said we have to do something different.
Mhm.
People aren't being treated with dignity. They have no hope. They're leaving with a scarlet letter they can never resolve. Can we do it differently? And they come up with this idea to respect human dignity, but also to put people in a solitary confinement to find what they believe was God. So if you could be alone in solitary, Quakers, and when you're alone in solitary, you can hear God and then you'll do good. But they also believed in economic mobility. They didn't use those words, but they looked at economic mobility and said, we need to make sure that they have a job, they have a skill they can leave with.
Mhm.
All of that great reform came out with mass solitary confinement. And
Mhm.
they saw, even before this place opened, that it was causing extreme mental health concerns. So I think that in the hesitation that you hear the professor through is we have to look at a legal system that is just and fair, but be careful. Be careful that the best idea we may have may not be the best idea. And that is something to be said about our society and democracy. A democracy in itself is an experiment, and an experiment needs constant attention, constant energy, and constant adjustment. Because if not, it can explode. And so there is no resting on your laurels in a democracy. And I think now you're to your point with our national conversation and our national concerns and issues around immigration, we are seeing that incarcerated world explode. It's always been a part of the story, let's be honest.
Yeah.
And we look at the original people incarcerated in Eastern State, many, many were immigrants. And
Mhm.
so, how do we see incarceration as a place to put others, a
Mhm.
place to control? And the original organizations, like the Prison Society of Pennsylvania, were established way back then to keep an eye because our job as citizens is to keep an eye on government structures. So, to your point, where there's very few places that can look in to see what's going on in prisons, Pennsylvania has a unique setting into our state constitution that the Prison Society can train volunteers to go in. So,
Mhm.
look to your state, look to your local area and say, where can you go in and witness? Be
Mhm.
a witness to our justice system, our
Mhm.
criminal legal system, and say, what can you do differently about it? And
Mhm.
then be a voice to take that out. So it
Mhm.
is our responsibility to create up a system of privileges and a system of fairness as
Mhm.
well. So let's dive into some of these questions. And thank you so much for that. That was so,
Sure.
such a journey through that that really gives us the truth. And
Mhm.
somebody said it earlier. I want to nerd out on this conversations and I want to be respectful for the pain and trauma that it has caused. And I
Oh,
am with
yes. Yeah.
that was perfect. You're absolutely right. You have to dig in and you have to respect and understand the pain around this system. So some of the questions that we've seen in the chat and the Q&A, and I'll read a few to you are
Mhm.
really trying to grapple and understand what is happening in our society today around the civil rights movement and around these conversations around DEI. So let me see if I can get that question up. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of problem with it. Okay. So one question is, how does DEI today compare to the civil rights movement of the past? Do you see similarities? Do you see a connection between and let me spell it out for everybody because I do
Mhm.
think sometimes when we label things as acronyms, it's not
Mhm.
always the healthiest to understand. So we see diversity, equity, and
Oh.
inclusion.
Mhm.
And so when we understand diversity is what makes up, we are a democracy, a pluralist democracy, and that in itself and inherently values diversity. Equity means people get what they need, and that might be different. So that's a little different than fair. It's equitable or even. And then inclusion, to your point earlier, is how are these laws being inclusive and or not inclusive? So how do you see that relationship between the civil rights movement of the past and the DEI conversations today?
Yeah. Oh, there's so many ways to tackle that. But one I would say is I think we're seeing an erosion of many of the civil rights gains through this device of pushing back on DEI. There are people, including myself, who have argued that diversity, equity, and inclusion was not a powerful enough approach to end structural racism in America. But despite that, what we're seeing is that the pushback against it is deeper than just closing offices and taking down words. It's a way of saying that the advances of the civil rights movement created harm by putting incompetent people into places. In other words, uh, the civil rights movement was actually a way of discriminating against white people, and that as a result of the diversity, equity, and inclusion campaigns that came out of it, there are now people who don't deserve to be in their positions. And then if you dig deeper, to me, what it's saying is white people should have those positions and non-white people are not deserving of those positions. It's a really profound reversal of thinking about who has rights in this nation, whose humanity should be respected in this nation. In other words, it's not just a point about changing labels from DEI to belonging or whatever other label you want. The thinking behind it is a way of really reversing, not just pushing back on civil rights gains, but reversing them altogether. And so, one point I'll make is that the connection between the debates going on today in the civil rights movement are about reversing the civil rights movement gains and reversing the thinking behind the civil rights movement that there should be equal respect for all human beings, regardless of race, and equal application of the law. That's being pushed back against. Now, another thing I would say is that there's also people who want a democratic society and want Black liberation and the end of structural racism, who believe the civil rights movement didn't go far enough because it was focused largely on integration and it was focused on um, to some extent, this is the critique anyway, on ending individual bias and wasn't focused enough on the way in which systems are designed to promote racial inequality and racial oppression. And so you have a rising abolitionist movement which is different from the civil rights movement. The abolitionist movement says we reforms of unjust, fundamentally unjust systems, systems that were designed to oppress, reforming them either covers up their oppression or might even facilitate it because it sends the message that we fixed it. This system is fine. We can go on arresting people and incarcerating people and deporting people because it's fair now. And abolitionists look to the history of how these systems were designed, what their function is, how they operate, and call for dismantling them. But again, I will emphasize importantly, envisioning, reimagining how to meet human needs without incarcerating people. And I would add, without taking their children away from them. Because again, as I said, I think there's a close connection between family policing and the criminal legal system. And we might say in this period, yes, we see that civil rights gains are being pushed back. The whole ethos of civil rights is being attacked. But we this is called to organize for an even more radical approach than the civil rights movement had. This is a call to examine deeply the very nature, the very foundations, the very ways of operating, the very thinking behind the systems we have in place now, and envisioning a very different future and thinking about how can we collectively work to make that future a reality. It's a different approach to reform. Uh, some have called this non-reformist reforms because yes, you have to have reforms. You do. I'm a lawyer and legal scholar. I believe that there is value in insisting that the Constitution be applied to people who are incarcerated, people who are marginalized. I've often said I've heard some people who say, "Well, we shouldn't we shouldn't even talk about the Constitution because it was created by slaveholders and it's oppressive. And yes, it's been interpreted that way, or we shouldn't even deal with the legal system at all." And my response to that is I have never met an incarcerated person, someone whose kids have been taken away from them, someone who's been denied health care, denied a job, uh, beat up by the police. I've never met one who said, I don't want a lawyer. I've never heard that, unless the police have convinced them that, not to ask for a lawyer, trick them into it. People want to assert their constitutional rights and have them apply. That may not be the be all and end all of creating a different society, but it's certainly a part of it. And it non-reformist reforms are directed toward a vision of a different society that is truly equal and humane and caring, and recognizing It's going to take work to do that, as opposed to a reformist approach, which says, well, it's everything's okay. We just need to fix these flaws in it, you know? And so I personally subscribe to the abolitionist approach, which is an approach that to me is realistic, it's historical, and it's visionary.
That was unbelievably helpful. And I just want to echo it because that was,
Mhm.
oh, I really just want to put that in a 2-minute video and be like, this right here. Because people do really get confused because they hear
Yeah,
the abolitionists and they're thinking of in ending slavery and the abolitionist movement. And so if I heard that correctly, and please
yeah,
course
yeah,
correct me there,
sure.
there's the reform, which is like the tweakers on the edge, is like
Yeah.
they're tweaking like and adjusting and tweaking.
Mhm.
Then the abolitionists, and then the non-reform reformists, which is so much about this conversation in the justice field, is where you come at it. But what I hear a lot from a larger public is this belief that when people do want to blow it up, that there's nothing there, like there is
No,
no
right.
exactly. And so I really
First of all,
that is
nobody is
really
talking.
helpful for people to understand.
Yes, no one is talking about blowing up anything. We're talking about incrementally changing, radically transforming how we meet people's needs, basically. That's what it's about. And I'll just correct one thing slightly. Not
Please.
okay, so I put non-reformist reforms within abolition.
Okay, got it.
Yes, but that's recognizing that we have to take incremental steps toward this vision. But the difference is you have a vision of something that doesn't cause suffering, that isn't harming people, that is truly meeting people's needs, that's truly keeping children safe and improving their welfare, which the prison system and the family policing system don't do. They don't do that, and they cause tremendous harm. And so it's that, to me, it's that vision. How do we move toward that? That's the Northern Star we're moving toward. And so we're not moving toward keeping these horrible systems and just, making some refinement of them. We're moving towards something that's more fundamental and more profound, more so the world, some abolitionists say, what is the world you would like? What's the world you want to live in? And how do we create that? And so non-reformist reforms are steps toward creating that. But they're not reformist because they're not just about reforming things as they are.
And this is really helpful because when we go through this, it
Hmm.
for Eastern State and its history and
Hmm.
the history of like thinking around incarceration, there is, to what end is the
Yes.
question.
Yeah.
And that is the question for society. To what end? To
Exactly.
where do we want to get to? And that
Hmm.
was actually when, people like Franklin and Benjamin Rush came together. They said, no, 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 to what end?
Yeah.
We want people to be active members of this community, active
Hmm.
members of society. So, how do we do it differently? And
Hmm.
again, the choices that they made, lots of issues there, lots of good ideas at the same time. I just don't want to like rose colored glasses there,
No,
like,
that's
no, no, no.
true.
Yeah, but
Well,
that's
that's
what
true.
humans do. We come up with, I got the best idea. And then, let's be honest, groupthink plays in there. And then they really hold on to what they thought was a good idea, even when the data tells them it's not. So I guess
Yeah.
for our community and listeners and educators and everybody and our students here today is, to what end? We want to have a safer society. We want to have happy and healthier people.
Yes.
And your other point, which you've said multiple times, and I
Mhm.
just want to finally echo again, is
Mhm.
we cannot look at this, and we talk about this all the time at work because we have a Center for Justice Education. We cannot look at this as the part only about incarceration, because that is just one chapter in the book. You
Mhm.
have to look at it as society's birth on.
Mhm.
What are those systems in place that are creating pipelines and pathways, and people can are put in that web at birth? And
Yes.
what
Yes.
are all there with zero exit ramps and
Yep.
tons of on ramps.
Yep.
So when are we looking? So this is why we have a collaboratory for justice education here at Eastern State, working with K through 12 teachers around the country to
Mhm.
say what is their role to ensure that their students are supported
Yeah.
and not pulled into this web and those pieces. So really over and over again, that conversation of how do we look at the entire society and how do we have healthy and democratically engaged and involved and welcomed
Yeah.
society members. So all of this is so important. I'm going to end with a zinger of a question that's from
Uh-oh.
Abby. And I know this is a good one though. So I was like, it's going to Abby.
Okay.
Abby's classroom is really has a lot of questions around this, and this is a zinger. So warning
Okay.
everybody, last question, even though there's been a million great questions in here. So Abby's students
Mm-hmm.
are in middle school
Mm-hmm.
and they want to understand really like where did this treatment of people of color start from? Why do I know I told you it was a
Okay.
zinger.
Okay.
Overall, students in our class are interested in why there has been a historically different treatment of people of color based or people based
Yes.
on race. And
Yes.
I giggle a little and I don't mean to giggle because this is a really big question.
It
So I
is.
mean that I only gave you 5 minutes, but go for it,
It, it,
professor.
it's so important. And I've had this question when I've spoken with elementary school students and high school students. And this is why I think it's so important that we continue to make part of our education the history of the United States, its entanglement with slavery and structural racism. Because for young people, if they just look at the way our society is structured, they see that white people are in positions of power, and they see that non-white people are not generally. I mean, they can see the difference, okay? They can see the difference. And so they have to ask, why is that? If you don't understand the history, I'm going to go back in a minute to the very invention of the concept of race. If you don't understand the history of slavery, of settler colonialism, you would think there's something wrong with Black people, with brown people, and there's something wonderfully special about white people. Because how do you explain it? That's why I really think these efforts to take teaching about slavery, take teaching about what we're talking about today out of curricula is so damaging. It's so damaging. How do you understand the way our society is structured, and why is it that white people get these benefits and privileges and people of color don't? Through so many, we don't have time to talk about all the structural ways that happens, redlining and the way in which wealth is passed down through generations and employment discrimination and incarceration. All right, but I would go back, given the time we have, to make the point. And funny, I'm teaching a class to undergrads at Penn on race, science, and justice, and this is the point I'm going to make this afternoon. If I have a 5 o'clock class, I'm going to get to undergrads, that race was invented. The very concept, the very notion that seems so natural to us, but is made up, that human beings are divided into races and that people of different races have different qualities. They have different traits. They have different senses of morality. They have different intelligence. They have different um, emotions. This idea. And why else divide people into races unless you're going to say that they're different in some way? That notion was invented in the 1600s and really cemented in the 1600s and 1700s in order to support European conquest of other peoples, to enslave African people, to take the land, dispossess indigenous people all around the world, and conquer them and impose the values and the culture and the ways of thinking, and especially the domination of Europeans. This is absolutely historically documented. And that idea of human beings being separated naturally into races, most people still think that's true. Most people in America still think that's true. In fact, studies have shown if this isn't taught to students at some point, they believe that there's just some natural difference between Black people and white people and Asian people and maybe Latinx people, and that they're just born into those categories, and those categories were created in nature. And all the different stereotypes about people in each of those categories is just true. They're born that way. And that's why fundamentally we can see how structural racism, which is obviously discriminating against people, especially people of Black people, people of color, seems natural. It seems like there's nothing wrong with it, that that's just the way those people are. So, you know, how can you look at the disproportionate number, there's just the astronomical number of Black people who are incarcerated? How can you look at the astounding number of Black children who are removed from their homes by the child welfare system, what I call family policing system? Half of Black children in America will undergo a child welfare investigation. Now, how could you believe that that's fine? You would have to believe that there's something about Black people that makes them either vulnerable or even deserving of that kind of treatment. And that stems from a deeper belief that we are really divided into races and that we are really distinctly different kinds of human beings. That's just, I could go on then about all the structures that have impeded the opportunities of Black people and other non-white people over the centuries and how they've been passed down and reinforced. But one point I want to get across to the class is that we should start by questioning this very notion of biological race or a natural division of beings into races. I think that is fundamentally important because once you believe that there are human beings who are distinctly different from you and that their traits are inferior to yours, you can justify torturing them, incarcerating them, taking their children away from them, as is going on right now in the United States. And so that's just one point. I see somebody put up dehumanizing. Yes, it's now, of course, you cannot take away anyone's humanity, but you can have a way of thinking and a way of treating people that treats them as if they're not human. And that was rooted in slavery. That's exactly what slavery did. And those ways of thinkings have circulated in Jim Crow, in eugenics, in a lot of the rhetoric that's going on right now on the national stage and global stage. And that we need to end that way of thinking. And the only way to do that is to share the truth, the reality about our common humanity.
That was unbelievably powerful. It gives me even more joy that it came from our sixth grade class joining us
Yes,
today.
yes, so
Our
important.
students are so smart in this country, and of every age, our students are so smart. And Professor, that was such a brilliant. And I'm really impressed that you did that in five
Thank
minutes.
you.
Like, that was a really hard question. I was like, I can't do this. And thank you so much because you are giving the students exactly the understanding and also the call to action. And that is so true to the civil rights movement. What
Yeah,
is your call to action to say, how will I shine light on this untruth? How will I shine light on the truth? How do
yeah,
I shine light on the an injustice to
ab
make justice? What do I
absolutely.
personally have to do? What is your call to do to ensure that we
Absolutely.
have a society that's even-handed justice and fair? And
Yes.
so this is so unbelievably powerful. And the idea that you start with questioning, question that does not sit right. That
Yeah.
is not right. And you question your own mind too, because our minds are really good good at telling ourselves things like that.
Yeah.
And we have to break our minds from behaving that way. And so
Yep.
this has been so amazing. Professor,
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining us today. Students all over the country, thank you so much for joining us today. I think we have done such a powerful conversation, and I can't wait. So the next time that you come back and join us again,
I'd
and
be
Professor
happy
Roberts, it's
to.
going to be a lot. So we are
Thank
big dreams for
you.
you.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much.
Thank you too. Thanks for inviting me and thanks for having this program. It's so exciting to hear that a sixth grade class is being enlightened about this. It's so important and hopefully call to action as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We'll send out to everybody everything that's going on throughout this MLK weekend and a roundup. And Professor Roberts, again, we are so honored and so grateful that you joined us today. Thank you.
Thank you too. Take care.
Take care. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you from Eastern State, and we'll have a good one and see you soon online or on site. Bye bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.